Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. The topic for this particular discussion is to turn our attention to the functioning of markets. And if you think back to the circular flow model, we talked about markets are the interaction of these two groups, the buyers on one side, the sellers on the other. And so when we analyze the interaction between the two groups, we'll notice that they have totally opposite desires. Buyers want to pay what price? Zero, right? Sellers want to receive what price? Infinite price, right? Good. So it's kind of interesting that their desires are, as I said, just the opposite of each other. And we had talked about the various forms of competition, and we said economic competition is this exchange system where households who own most of the resources have two sets of decisions to make. That is, who to sell my resources to or who to rent them to, and then what goods and services I'm going to purchase, and when will I spend the money, or how much will I put aside through credit markets for the future. And our assumption is they're trying to maximize utility in doing that. On the other side, if you look at the functioning of the firms, again, they have three sets of decisions to make, three different markets to participate in. They are buyers in the resource market, and they are sellers in the product market. And they move in both directions in the credit market. And sometimes they're borrowers, sometimes they are repaying previous loans. And our assumption about firms is they're trying to maximize economic profit, and this is an important distinction in the economic analysis from the accounting analysis. Remember that when we talk about economic profits, we're talking about the revenue flow coming in minus the economic cost of production, and that is the opportunity cost of the resources involved. So economic profits mean that you're doing better here than in your best alternative. The best alternative is often called the normal rate of return for that set of resources. And it differs across various kinds of products. The normal rate of return on small appliances is about 6%. That's the average rate of return for the firms in that area. So if you're making economic profits, it means you're doing better than the best alternatives. And that is the result of risk-taking. Economic profits occur when the firm is taking risk, when the firm is doing something that other people are not in fact doing. And markets, we said, are the interaction of these two groups. Finally, in our economic system, we noted that the role of money is critical because money is the intermediary good between all these transactions. You provide the use of your resources, you rent your time by the hour or by the month or by the year, and you receive a flow of dollars in exchange for that. And then you use the dollars, as I said, to buy the goods and services. 70% of U.S. production is repurchased by American households. And so the economy is, very much consumer-driven in the United States system. And again, you use money as the means of exchange. And so you buy things and use the money for that transaction in that way. I may have talked before about the cause of the Great Depression, which we did not understand at the time, but Milton Friedman and his wife went back in 1970 and put together the history of the amount of banks and the amount of deposits in banks, which is the major transactions portion of the money supply, and realized that between 29 and 33, the amount of money in the system declined by 1/3, and the number of banks declined by 1/3. And that is why the Great Depression continued, because there wasn't enough money in the system to be used for all the transactions that would require the use of money. We came out of the Depression in World War II because at that time the United States government let all kinds of contracts for number one, they hired 1/3 of the people, which is approximately the amount that were unemployed. And then they bought all the stuff for them, right? Everything, the clothes and the tanks and the bombers and airplanes and so forth. And that was financed by the sale of government bonds. That is the way the government borrows money, is to sell bonds. As they sold the bonds, the central bank purchased the bonds. And we'll do a little more of this later on. But by doing that, they monetized the debt, meaning they created new money in the system to actually pay for the expenditures of the government. And in doing that, we created enough money for the economy to come back to full employment. At the end of World War II, there was real concern that we would go back into depression because the government was not spending as much, right? They stopped all this expenditures they were doing. And there was great fear that we would slip back into a depression. It turns out that during the war, people were being paid salaries, all the people who were fighting and the soldiers, and there was very little to buy because there were we had switched production from consumption goods to finance the war. And so there had been a large amount of money that had been saved during that time period. And as they came back, we then provided the GI Bill for the people to go to colleges free. We provided guaranteed loans for purchasing houses and so forth. And so the economy moved safely into a consumption economy as we have today. So we noted the existence of scarcity means that every society has to answer these three questions. Which goods will be produced? What will be the method of production? And who will end up getting the goods? For whom will the goods be produced? So as we said, markets are the interaction of buyers and sellers. Some markets are local, like a Domino's pizza market might be 5 miles out. Some markets are international. Honda Motor Corporation sells cars all over the world. And the distinction of whether the market is small or large is primarily the ratio of the transportation expenditure relative to the value of the product. Think about it. A pizza sells for like 10 or 11 bucks. You're not going to drive 26 miles to get, to buy a pizza. But Honda can ship cars all over the world for about $200 per contract. And the cars sell for $30,000. So that's why that is a global market for that particular firm. So as we said, to study the market, we focus in on the two groups separately. We focus on buyers' behavior first and develop all the factors which would influence the purchase of goods by the buying group. Then we turn our attention to a separate model, which is to study of sellers' behavior, that is obviously supply, and build that model, incorporating all the factors that influence the amount they're willing and able to sell at each price. And then finally, we bring the two models together and we look at the interaction of markets and what implications follow from the assumptions we've made about the behavior of the two groups. In doing that, we employ this assumption of what is called ceteris paribus. And that is, as I study buyers' behavior or sellers, I'm going to look at one factor at a time. Ceteris paribus means, as I think about the effect of an increase in income on demand, I'm assuming all other things are not changing. And that's what ceteris paribus means. If you want to be scientific, you have to have some Latin terminology to throw around to impress people, right? You have to be able to say, well, that's true, ceteris paribus. And, oh, right, ceteris paribus, good. So that's what it means, one factor at a time. So as we think about buyers and the willingness to purchase something, we know that each buyer has some maximum amount that they would be willing to spend to buy a particular additional unit of a good. And that is called marginal value. The value is what is measured in dollars, the maximum I'm willing and able to pay to get a particular unit. Notice in terms of terminology, it's also called the reservation price. It's the highest price I'm willing to pay to acquire one more unit. And if we graphed marginal value, if we put additional units across the horizontal and we graph the height of these additional units, it turns out that marginal value tends to decline. Marginal value of additional units tends to decline. Think of having a gallon of water for a week. How would you use it? Anybody? You only have 1 gallon of water. What would you do with it? Drink it in order to stay alive. Is that very valuable? Yes. In fact, if you think about it, if you had to, you'd be willing to give up all of your current wealth and perhaps even pledge future wealth to get that gallon in order to stay alive. Everybody with me? So the value of that first gallon is just a very, very high number. The second gallon you might use for personal hygiene. Very valuable, but not as much as staying alive, right? And the third you might use for the preparation of food, a highly valued use of water. But as you think about the value of additional gallons, you'd be using it for lower and lower valued uses. The 10th gallon you might use to grow vegetables, and then the 11th gallon you might use to have a lawn, and the 12th you might use to all the way down to the 650th gallon, which is the average consumption. It's actually much more than that. And that's to hose down the driveway, right, or do those kinds of things. So the assumption of economists is for every good, marginal value tends to decline. Think of the value of a tennis racket. What does it allow you to do? Play tennis with other people who have rackets, play tennis against the wall, and so forth. What's the value of a second identical racket? How would you use it? Anybody? Good. Back up in case the first one goes, or lend it to someone who doesn't have a racket. That expands the number of people I can play with. But the value of a third identical, fourth identical, fifth identical seems to decline. You've had a big tennis match, you've been on the court for 3 hours, you come off, and the value of that first Heineken's beer is really high, right? And then a second and a third, and I love this example because these guys in the back are all grinning about the 6th and the 7th one, right? So, good. So if I graphed it, it would be a downward sloping function. And notice I'm measuring marginal value as the height, and it would be declining for any possible good. And by the way, remember that we included in goods non-material goods such as time spent with a loved one. So think about Aunt Linda comes to visit, and she's your favorite aunt, right? And you haven't seen her in a couple of years, right? And think about the value of that first couple hours. She gets off the plane, and you're just excited to see her and so forth. And then that afternoon, you have a nice meal and a nice dinner, and then she stays for a second day and a third day and a 6th day. And by then, you're thinking, God, I forgot how much I hate her laugh, right? Good. Marginal value can also go negative, and then it no longer is a good. So it seems to apply to all goods. We draw these graphs as straight lines simply to make it easy to draw. We're not assuming that marginal value declines in a linear manner. We're not assuming that the value of the next unit is always the same decrease in value as the previous. But all we're saying is that marginal value declines. So that's all that the graph, in fact, means. And the data set is the height of the function above each additional unit. So the data set is, for the 6th unit, the marginal value is $5. For the 3rd unit, the marginal value is $8. So it's an estimate of the most I'm willing to pay for that one additional unit. And right now, based on your taste and preference, your personal preferences about things, based on your income and those factors, you have a marginal value schedule for all the goods that are out there, right? There's some amount you'd be willing to pay for the first unit, the second unit, and so forth. But we don't think about it because we make decisions on the margin about, will I buy the 5th pizza at a price of $10? So demand, as you know, is a schedule of the quantities that the individual is willing and able to purchase at alternative per unit prices, and quantities measured horizontally. So the quantity demanded at each price would be the distance to the function, and it is the same function as the marginal value function. Demand is a schedule of the different quantities willing and able to buy at different possible prices. So we can read the demand curve, as I said, as the quantity demanded at each price. If the price is $8, we're predicting that the individual would buy, I think it's 3 units, 3 8 are 24. And the reason is you compare the value of each unit with the price. So the value of the first unit is what? Just look at the graph. The value of the first unit is $10, price is $8. Yeah, I'd make the purchase. It's worth $10 to me. Second unit I value at $9. The price is $8. I'd make the purchase. Third unit is just valued at $8. So I'm willing to make the purchase because it brings me that much value. Do you want a fourth unit? Excellent, good. You do. You want a fourth unit, but it's not worth $8 to you. And so when the price is $8, the quantity demanded would be 3. If the price falls to $5, then you'd buy these additional units where the marginal value is greater than or equal to 5. So at $5, the quantity demanded would be 6. At $2, the quantity demanded would be 9, etc. So demand is this whole data set. Demand is this whole series of quantities at alternative prices. And that is critical to understand. Demand is the whole schedule. Y'all with me? Good. A change in price just leads you to a different quantity demanded. A change in price does not change the value function or the demand curve. It simply moves you to a different quantity demanded. So as we said, we read demand horizontally at each particular price. And because marginal value declines, when you apply that to the concept of demand, the first law of demand is that demand's downward sloping. As the price falls, people are willing and able to purchase a larger quantity. As the price rises, the willingness to or ability to buy decreases. Good. So demand is always downward sloping. That's why it's called the first law of demand. Economics is actually a simple science. There are only 3 laws in the entire science. And the first is this assumption that it is always the case that if price falls sufficiently, people in fact will buy more, or if price rises sufficiently, people will buy less. Now, we draw it as this straight line function, but again, it's critical to understand what we mean by this and what we don't mean by this. This looks like we're saying that if the price goes up by a little tiny bit, you're going to buy a smaller quantity, right? If you read this graph literally, that's what it would say. And in fact, it would also say it's a linear function. We're not assuming that at all. And people who don't understand economics, this is where they criticize economics. They say that we assume that when you walk into the grocery store, you have knowledge of every price of every item in there. Y'all with me? They say we assume perfect knowledge, which we don't. And they say that if you go into the store and you notice that Heinz ketchup has gone up by 10 cents, then that night you would put a little bit less ketchup on your French fries. Well, that's absurd, right? Economists don't think that at all. What we think is when you walk in the grocery store, you don't even know what most of the items are, right? And you certainly don't know what the prices are. And you know, you just go in and buy the things you want, and you decide I'm going to have 4 pizzas and 2 6-packs of whatever is the case. And we're not assuming that for every change in price that the quantity demanded changes. And that's why I've rewritten the first law of demand to be more accurate. And that is, if price goes up by enough, people will buy less. And if price falls by enough, people would tend to be willing to buy more. Gasoline prices jump around all the time. You guys know this, right? You go in and it's $3.70 and then, or $3.25, and then you go in next time it's $3.50, and then you go in next time and it's $2.97 or whatever. You almost don't even look at the price. You all with me? You almost don't even look at the price, right? Because you know you're going to fill the tank anyway, unless it's close to the end of the month, and then you have to think about So that's not a violation of the first law of demand. The demand for gasoline is very inelastic. It doesn't adjust a lot when prices, in fact, do change. But what we're saying is if the price goes to $20 a gallon, you will buy less gas. Everybody with me? For a sufficient increase, quantity demand, it will decline. And that's enough for now. Good. Change in price is a movement along the function, not a change in the function. A change in the function would be something else has changed besides the market price. Something else has changed that influences the amount you're willing to buy. And that would be a shift in demand, a change in demand. And a change in demand means the whole function moves. An increased demand would mean a larger quantity at each price. A decreased demand would be a leftward shift, a smaller quantity at each price. Again, we draw them as horizontal, we draw them as parallel. We're not assuming that. It could be, tilted or whatever. But, when this factor changes, it just says demand increases for it. Good. So we want to enumerate then all the other things besides the price, which comes to you from the marketplace, all the other things that might change in you that would cause you to buy more of a good or less of a good. And they are called the shift factors. They're called the determinants of demand. They're the other factors which would influence how much you buy at alternative prices. Well, the first is what we call taste and preference. The economist phrase for how much you actually enjoy the good, how much you like the good. Economics does not investigate why your taste and preference are what they are. Psychologists do. And psychologists will tell you that, for example, the reason you like turkey is because when you grew up, if Thanksgiving was a happy time for the family, then you associate that happiness with the desire for turkey. If you had a dysfunctional family and Thanksgiving was always awful, then you probably would not have a good taste for, a high taste for turkey. We simply assume that at any moment in time you have some set of preferences, And they can change instantaneously. As you think about some new information, your taste and preference can change. I'm going to have a third muffin. And then all of a sudden, and it's free. And then all of a sudden, I remember that I'm eating lunch with somebody in an hour. So taste and preference can shift as factors shift. Taste and preference also change as information changes, or as your knowledge of how to do something changes. That's all wrapped into shifts in taste and preference. In the summertime, you have a high demand for electricity because you're going to use it because the ambient temperature outside is high. In the wintertime, your demand for electricity declines, your demand for natural gas increases because then you're going to be heating the house. Those would be called changes in taste and preference by the economic model. So taste and preference really is kind of a catch-all factor, and if demand changes and it's not one of the other factors, then it's taste and preference. You all with me? Like I said, changes in your ability, changes in your knowledge, all these things would affect taste and preference. I tell the story of years ago, Katie Couric was on the Today Show, and they thought it was necessary to let people know how much fat was in Mexican food. And so they had a table laid out with all the different dishes. And then behind each one, they had a 1-inch tube of a gray liquid that looked like fat. And they were pointing out to you how much fat was in each item. So here's a burrito, and there's this, and then here's a tostado, and then here's various other things. It was a horrible presentation. It was really disgusting, right? Now stop and think about it. You saw that in the morning. Now it's lunchtime at work, and somebody says, "How about Mexican today?" Well, what's likely to be true about your taste and preference? Tanked, right? And they did. And Mexican restaurant sales went down dramatically on that day, and then gradually, as the memory fades, then it came back up again. So changes in knowledge can affect taste and preference. Secondly, clearly how much money you make or how much money you have, meaning either income or wealth, affects your ability, number one, to buy various goods and services. So in general, for what we call normal goods, it's a positive relationship. In general, as you earn more income, you'll buy more of various things. As your income goes up, you'll buy more sushi, more wine, more square footage of condo space, more units of qualityness of stereo systems, more units of qualityness of all kinds of things. So for normal goods, as we said, and that's what a normal good means, positive relationship. Income goes up, you buy more of those particular goods. To make the analysis complete, though, we realize that in some cases, as income rises, you actually buy less of certain goods. So we define those as being inferior goods. It doesn't mean low quality. It simply means as income rises over some range, demand declines for those goods. You're an immigrant to the country. So you come in and you don't have any money. And so you begin to earn money, and you earn enough money now to be able to buy a Kia, right, which is a small, inexpensive car. Good. You then get a degree from CSUN, your knowledge goes up, your income goes up, and over this range, you buy fewer Kias and you buy a BMW, right, or you buy something else. So over this range, the Kia becomes an inferior good. There's a product called Hamburger Helper. You all know what it is, right? You mix it with hamburgers and it adds flavor. And it's basically powdered fat in a box, right? And that's what it is. And so maybe as a starving student, you buy it three times a month. Once income goes up, you're likely to buy none of it, right? So in that example, it's an inferior good, right? And then you buy more prepared meals from Gelson and so forth. So income has two possible directions of effect. Normally, positive relationship, inferior goods, inverse relationship. Clearly, as I spend money on one good, what I'm giving up of other goods depends upon the price of other goods. So changes in the price of other goods would affect my demand for any particular product. Most goods are substitutes. Most goods are alternative ways of gaining utility or satisfaction. I can get utility from watching the Golden State Warriors destroy the Celtics in a fantastic game, or eating a great lobster dinner, or traveling, or spending time with a loved one. All those things are alternative ways of getting satisfaction. When a substitute becomes cheaper, particularly a close substitute, then I would tend to buy more of that item, increase quantity demanded, right, and less of the other item. And the easiest example is take two really similar products, Little Caesars Pizza and Domino's Pizza. Are they similar? Yeah. Are they the same? No, but they're very close substitutes. If Little Caesars goes on sale and they lower their price, people would tend to buy a larger quantity of Little Caesars, and that would decrease demand for Domino's. Y'all with me? Good. So as substitutes become more expensive, I'd buy more of the main product. As substitutes become cheaper, I would buy less of it. And again, how close the substitutes are would determine how big the effect is, how big the magnitude is. After 9/11, we grounded all aircraft that were flying because we didn't know how many more flying bombs there were. And we came back 4 days later and reopened commercial airlines. But the cost of flying had gone up dramatically because now you had all these safety things about, like, we didn't have TSA at the time, but we had people there to check your bags and check you and so forth. So the cost of flying commercially became much greater. Cost meaning time value as well as the actual price of the ticket. So what would be the substitute products that would be affected? Yeah.
Trains.
Good. Trains.
Maybe like cruises.
Sure. Buses, car travel, right? Skateboards, bicycles, not close substitutes, but email is a substitute, right, for going somewhere and so forth. The closest substitute is private flying. And when this happened, we predicted that there would be a big increase in demand for private aircraft and private flying. Lear had just come out with a new jet that was it's a four-seater that was like $1 million, and their profits went through the roof because they sold right away, right? Because all these companies said, we're going to buy a plane now because our executives don't have time to spend standing around in line at airports. What I didn't predict was that there would be a whole new industry that arose, and that was renting out planes by the hour for people to use. So all these people who own planes, and people went out and bought planes for this purpose, would sell you hours of flight time. And they're 4-seaters, 6-seaters, 12-seaters, 20-seaters, all these different size planes. Your company could buy like 15 hours, and it was, you reserved 15 hours and you paid for it, whether you used it or not. Y'all with me? But just this tremendous industry arose, and the reason is, if you're flying on a private plane, number one, you don't fly out of LAX, you fly out of Van Nuys, right, or Burbank, or some much easier place. And to get on the plane, you simply show them your ID, right? You show them who you are, and that's all that's required. So notice a raise in the cost or price of commercial flying greatly increased the demand for a close substitute, which was private flying. Again, to be complete, though, we noticed that some goods are used together in an activity. And so we define them as complementary products or complements. And if you think about an activity, many activities use a whole bunch of products. Think about playing tennis. Tennis balls, tennis rackets, tennis courts, tennis shoes, and then tennis shorts, and then a tennis visor, and then rosin for your hand, and a towel, and a bag to carry all your stuff to the tennis court. Those are all complementary products. They're all used in that activity. If tennis balls go up to $50 a can, what would happen to the demand for tennis rackets? It would go down, right? Because it's really expensive to play now. You wouldn't play as much. The racket would last for a longer period of time, etc. Good. So there we get the opposite kind of an effect. A rise in the price of a complement would decrease demand for the complementary good, right? Because the activity's gotten more expensive. If you lower the price of the complement, so Wilson puts bats on sale, then that makes it cheaper, and you'd increase your demand for gloves or balls or whatever the case may be. Good. So price of other goods, two possible directions, substitute and complements. Fourth factor, is a change in your expectations about future prices. A change in your expectations about the price in the future. If you now believe that something's going to become cheaper in the next time period, what would you do today? Yeah, you buy less, right? Because it's going to be cheaper in the future. Or vice versa. If you think something's going to become more expensive in the future, then you'd buy more of it today before the price goes up, right? Good. Standard example of this is financial assets like stocks. And if you think the price of stocks is going to go up, that would increase your demand to buy them today, right? And it's a strong relationship, as you are witnessing right now. If you think the price is going to fall like 1,000 points in one day, then your incentive is to sell or not to buy in that case. So changes in your expectation about the future affect demand today. Coffee is grown, coffee is the second highest export from Colombia with the letter C. It's the second highest volume, right? And so people who are in the market for coffee are constantly looking at the potential of a change in future supply. And speculators actually hire weather forecasters to follow these low pressure systems that form off the west coast of Africa and then make their way across the Atlantic. And those are the potential for storms to occur, tropical storms and then hurricanes being the obvious one. And as they get bigger and as they get closer to Colombia, there's a stronger prediction that you're going to have a decline in production from Colombia, raising the price in the future. The second group of experts they hire are experts on coffee growth. And if the storm hits and the coffee beans are just starting, they're real close to the stem and they're real small, the effect of the storm is not that large. You all with me? You know, the rain, the winds don't destroy that much. If the storm hits when you're about to harvest, the beans are big and heavy and they're about ready to fall off anyway. So these guys will predict what's the percentage change, and they do it the probability estimate, not one amount, but you know, a probability estimate of the likely loss of quantity. The third group are economists. And the economists are hired to say, if there's a 10% reduction in production, how much is price likely to go up? What is that a measure of? The percentage change in quantity in response to a percentage change in price, or in this case, price in response to quantity. Elasticity, good. And so the expert economist would then give you estimates of, you know, if it's a 9% reduction, we'd anticipate this much of a change in price. And speculators buy coffee in large amounts and put it into storage if they think that the future is going to be a smaller supply. And so it increases demand today, which drives up current price, but then when they sell it in the future, it reduces future price. So speculators actually lead to a reduction in volatility over time, as opposed to what they're normally talked about is that they raise prices. Well, they raise prices now, but they lower prices in the future, or vice versa, right? Depending on what the change is expected to be. Good. So market demand is so that's it, and that again see how simple the model is. Buyers are influenced by these 5 factors: taste and preference, income, normal, inferior, right? Price of other goods, substitutes and complements, price expectations. That's the complete model. And if you're studying engineering or architecture, you have to know like 40 different factors, right? And the magnitude of each one, like on tension, simple theory, 5 factors. To get to market demand, we simply add up the demand functions of the people who are buyers in the market. The market demand represents the sum of the behavior of the individuals currently defined as being in the market. And so it is the horizontal sum of the quantities demanded at each price. Obviously, more buyers would mean a bigger demand, right? People moving into the area would raise demand. They discovered how to process shale oil and how to get oil out of the ground from shale. And actually, the guy in Texas figured it out like in 1957. But it wasn't until recently that we had the breakthrough of learning a lot more about it, and then being able to drill horizontally underneath the ground, and then also what are the chemical additives that break the rock the most or allow the liquid the most intensity to push the oil out. And they discovered that there were large deposits up in North Dakota. And so all of a sudden, these companies opened up and offered jobs to guys to run the drills, right? And there was this tremendous movement of people into those areas. And that raised, of course, the demand for housing, demand for food, demand for all the things that were in that particular area. And prices went up substantially. Some of the companies actually built their own little one-unit trailers for their workers because there was not, there wasn't that much housing available to them. And then in Detroit, you had the opposite situation, and that is with the decline of the auto industry, a lot of companies shut down. And remember, that means all the supply companies also went out of business, right? All these companies that made bumpers and all the parts that go into it shut down. So you had this tremendous exit of people from Detroit, and then also housing prices fell dramatically because in Detroit they had built a whole bunch of new developments, and all these people who bought on the adjustable rate mortgages couldn't afford the property, and so when their income went down, then they went bankrupt, and there are whole areas of Detroit that are now vacant. There are whole area neighborhoods where just the whole area is in fact down. So a decline in number of buyers would decrease demand in that way. And then, as I said, this is looking at how market demand is the sum of the demand functions for the buyers. So in this case, I have 3 different buyers. You'll notice they have differences in demand. Could be taste and preference, could be income. We don't know what it is, but they have differences in demand. But the sum of their willingness to buy then is market demand. Market demand interacting with the willingness of sellers to produce determines market price. And then the price comes back as a piece of information to all the various buyers. And so Ms. A looks at the price of pizzas, and they're $10, and she decides, I'm going to buy 6 of them because she's having guests come over or something like that. Mr. B has different taste and preference at a price of 10. Looks like he buys, what did I say, 6? He buys 3. Mr. C buys 1. So the total 10 units are allocated by price across the various buyers. The price is what determines who ends up getting their portion of that market demand. And notice that each one adjusts, so the marginal value just matches market price. And consequently, the marginal value across buyers is the same. Mr. C only has 1 pizza, but that's the only one that's worth $10 to him, right? Good. So you notice something interesting about it. The price has allocated the goods to the highest valued users, and that's called the allocative function of price. Price has moved the quantity being produced out among the buyers such that you've maximized the value to society of those particular units. Because only people willing to pay more or equal to the price are the ones who end up receiving it in that case. Good. So that completes our analysis of the buyer's side of the market.